So we got some big news for everybody that dropped yesterday. I don't know how many of you were following the French election, but we had what people are calling a shock victory by what's called the far left coalition over the far right. So for those of you who don't know, Macron is a centrist, and he's governed France for quite a while now. A lot of people are not happy with him. He's kind of a classic neoliberal. I guess it's fair to call him like the Obama of France. And France historically is significantly to the left of the United States of America. So Macron's victory was sort of a shock, and he's governed for a while, and there's a lot of discontent. And so we just had elections, and what you saw was a surge in support for both the far right and the far left. But there was actually, in the first round of the elections, this is a parliamentary system, it's different, there was more support for the far right than there was for the far left. So they were already sort of celebrating, and they thought it was a foregone conclusion that they were going to win. But what happened is you had a strategic alliance between the far left and the center left, right? And, the people who are in Macron's party. And whoever couldn't win would drop out and endorse the other one. So in some instances, you had, the far lefty, if they were down to the centrist in a given district, they would drop out and endorse the centrist, and vice versa, which is kind of shocking, I know, because you know that in the U.S., the center never coalesces with the so-called far left. They hate the far left. But in this instance, many centrists, if they were behind the far left in the first round of the elections, they would drop out and endorse the far leftist, right? And so what ended up happening is the far left surged and ended up winning. So this is just, there's a little bit of a breakdown here. Now, these numbers are not exact. These are what the projections were early on, but this is roughly within the range of what it's going to be. So you're going to have 190 part of the Popular Front, which is the left coalition, the so-called far left coalition. The reason I say so-called far left, you'll see that in a minute. You have the Macronists are actually going to come in second with 163 seats. Then you have the far right, which again won the first round, was leading the first round, and they were convinced they were going to win the whole thing in the second round, right? They ended up finishing in third, which is 133 seats. And the Republicans, which is another right-wing group here, they finished with 65. So, in other words, the left gained 59 seats, the center lost 87, and the far right gained 44. So, huge news. Now, so what does this so-called far left coalition believe in? Well, let's dive into that a little bit here. So they call themselves the New Popular Front, and they're a broad left-wing electoral alliance of political parties in France. They launched on June 10th, so very recently, in response to Snap 2024 French legislative election. The front brings together a bunch of different groups. So there's like the Socialist group, the Socialist Party, the Environmentalist Party, the French Communist Party, and several other left-leaning parties and groups. And here's what they say. While pushing for mobilization of associations, union forces, and civil society, the name is a reference to the old Popular Front, an electoral alliance that included communists which ruled France in the 1930s in order to prevent fascism or Nazism from winning an electoral majority. The front's programs include scrapping the 2023 French pension reform law, which lowered people's pensions, and they hated it, increasing public sector salaries and welfare benefits, raising the minimum wage by 14%, and freezing the price of basic food items and energy. This would be funded by reintroducing a wealth tax, scrapping many tax breaks for the wealthy, and raising income tax on the highest earners. On other issues such as foreign policy, the front's policies are closer to the center left. So they say that, but then if I type in here, let's type in Palestine. Okay. Within the framework of a two-state solution, the front's platform calls for France to recognize the state of Palestine. In fact, Mélenchon, who's one of the leaders of this left-wing coalition, came out and said, oh, one of the things we're going to do is recognize a Palestinian state ASAP. And they want to enforce an arms embargo against Israel. Now, they're not insane, so they still say, hey, October 7th, that was terrorism. They killed a lot of civilians. That's not okay. But they want an arms embargo against Israel, and they want to recognize a Palestinian state. When it comes to the issue of Ukraine, I guess this is why they say they're, quote, center-left on foreign policy. But basically, they're like, look, Ukraine's a sovereign country. Russia shouldn't have invaded it. That was wrong. It's hard to view that as just center-left. It just seems like common sense, right? You could think whatever you want to think about how we got to the point that Russia invaded Ukraine. And of course, it's fair to bring up, hey, NATO is being provocative and aggressive by building up on Russia's border. But at the end of the day, I think every reasonable person agrees that Russia invading Ukraine is, of course, a massive overreach and it's aggression, right? And so they recognize that, and I guess that's why their foreign policy is called center-left and not quote-unquote far-left, right? So anyway, looks pretty reasonable to me. Now, this is one of the things that the conservatives are freaking out about on Twitter. French leftist plan includes 90% top marginal income tax rate. France's leftist alliance would raise the top marginal income tax rate to 90% if it were to take over the government following legislative elections that run through July 7th. So, as you're all about to see, if you go on Twitter and you see right-wingers talking about this, none of them have any fucking idea what a marginal tax rate is. I love it every time marginal tax rates are discussed, because I'm not sure I've ever seen a conservative who actually knows what a marginal tax rate is, but they are super outraged by the thing that they don't understand in the slightest. So what is a marginal tax rate? A marginal tax rate is everything above a certain line gets taxed at that higher rate, 90%. Now, usually there's also loopholes and deductions, so it's not effectively a 90% rate. It would effectively probably be lower. Certainly that's the case in the U.S. I don't know how it is in France. I don't know if they have all the loopholes and deductions like we have here. But it's every dollar over a certain amount is what's taxed at 90%. So it's not what people think. Idiots will come out and say, the government's trying to take 90% of their money. That is just... if you think that, you're just wrong, okay? You're just wrong, and you need to learn about what a marginal tax rate is. Now, what's interesting is the line that they use. So, like I said, France is generally to the left of the United States of America, and it is reflected in when this rate kicks in. You would never see this in the United States of America. But, so the 90% rate would apply. The top rate would apply on taxable income over $440,000. $440,000. Now, in the U.S., we did have a time when we had very high marginal income tax rates, but the line was higher. It was at least over $1 million, right? In France, they say, basically, if you make over $500,000, everything over that $500,000 number, we're going to tax at 90%. So that's a very, very progressive tax rate. Truth be told, that's actually to the left of where I am. I love the idea of a marginal tax rate that's super high like this, 70%, 90%, thereabouts, but I would probably kick it in more over if you made $5 million a year, $10 million a year. The other thing I support is a wealth tax, so that like a no billionaires tax. So everybody who's worth more, like $999,999,999, every dollar above that, I'm fine with taxing at 100%. There should be no billionaires. The idea that, this person can't get by with $873 million. It's like, shut the fuck up. What are we doing here? It's egregious that we have any billionaires. And by the way, reporting is, in the near future, we'll probably have our first trillionaires. So that's unacceptable, the massive income and wealth inequality, which has some people being homeless and other people can literally buy small countries. So anyway, you're going to see a lot of right-wingers have no idea what a marginal tax rate is. Here's an interesting point for everybody. Top marginal tax rate in the U.S. was 92% in the 1950s. And that was called the Decade of Prosperity. The economy overall grew by 37% during the 1950s in the U.S., and unemployment remained low, about 4.5%. At the end of the decade, the median American family had 30% more purchasing power than at the beginning. So in other words, if you tax the rich and you redistribute that, it turns out it's very good for the middle class and for the poor. What a shocker. If you tax the wealthy, you can take that money and do a lot of very based things with it. I know, crazy. And I love this. This is amazing. New York Times, quote, while many in France cheered what appeared to be a loss for the far right, others were fearful of what the far left might bring. Here's the terrifying stuff the far left is bringing you. The far left's proposed platform includes raising France's monthly minimum wage, lowering the legal retirement age from 64 to 60, building 1 million new affordable housing units in 5 years, and freezing the prices of basic necessities, including food, energy, and gas. The state would also pay households all costs associated with their children's education, including meals at cafeterias, transportation, and extracurricular activities. Instead of drastically cutting immigration, as the far right had promised, the coalition pledged to make the asylum process more generous and smooth. The New Popular Front has pledged to come up with tens of billions of euros needed to pay for its programs by taxing wealthy individuals. Quote, "It's time to tax the super rich and the super profits," said Mr. Faure to Cheers Sunday night. So that's the terrifying stuff that the left wants to do. Every single one of those things, or almost every single one of those things, has a strong majority of support. And not only is that the case in France, but I bet in this instance in the US too, if you polled those things, it would have a strong majority of support. Now, by the way, what happens from here? We don't really know yet, right? We don't really know what happens from here because the prime minister came out, not the president. Macron is the president. The prime minister came out and said, I'm going to go ahead and step down. I'm going to go ahead and resign. And apparently Macron said this morning, no, you're not. I reject your resignation. You're staying in power. So it looks like Macron is trying to stay in power until 2027. The left coalition came out and said, you got to step down. Mélenchon came out and said, we have a mandate. Macron, you got to go. We're done with you, right? So Macron is basically being defiant and saying, no, I don't want to do that. So now negotiations are going to happen in terms of finding a governing coalition. And look, it's possible Macron steps down and the left coalition takes over and they pick their president. It's also possible that Macron cuts a deal with the left, even though it looks unlikely right now because of the rhetoric coming from the left. And in that instance, even Macron, his hand would be forced to do more left-wing things, right? But it's also possible that even though Macron had, been slamming the far right and saying we got to do whatever we can to defeat the far right, it's also possible that you get a governing coalition that involves Macron, so the center, and the far right. And in that instance, Macron stays in power until 2027, and he would probably do even more conservative things. So at this point in time, I think any of those things are on the table. But the fact of the matter is, the so-called far left coalition did the best by far. And they absolutely should get their day. They should get their policies. They should get their president. And guess what? If you actually do that, this is how you defeat the far right for good. You don't defeat the far right with centrism. Centrism nurtures the far right. You defeat the far right with the so-called far left, which is really just policies that help your average person and make them feel like they're not hopeless anymore. So really interesting stuff happening in France. Honestly, it was the best case scenario. And by the way, look, maybe this is a harbinger of things to come in the US. Maybe it is. Maybe it's not, but maybe it is. But the fact of the matter is, in Mexico, the left-wing candidate won. In the UK, the Labour Party defeated the Conservatives. Now we have in France, the so-called far left is defeating the far right. And I think there's even one or two more examples that I'm blanking on at the moment of the left winning. And in the case of France, remember, the far right had the lead in the polls in the first round, and everybody thought it was a foregone conclusion that the far right would win. I actually told you guys right after that first round, it's possible the left wins here if some of the centrists do the right thing, and that ended up happening. So, hey man, far right, polling leads, everybody expects them to win, and then they implode, and the left wins. This has happened in a number of places. One can only hope that happens here as well. But the fact of the matter is it's a little different when you have a president who's genuinely sundowning and sort of dragging the rest of the ticket down, the down ballot races down, and is sort of being defiant. I don't know. I genuinely don't know what's going to happen, but hopefully this is a harbinger of things to come, and we see this be the case in the US as well. Hey y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.